Sorry, I took the head.
We'll get started. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Maria Gillescu, and I am the co-chair of the Center on Global Energy Policy Women in Energy program. The program seeks to grow the presence and leadership of women in energy and energy-related sectors. And I'm also a member of the Center on Global Energy Policies Advisory Board. Today, we're going to discuss how the financial world is responding to shifting energy and environmental policies with an expert panel of women who will explore issues related to both conventional and renewable energy. I will introduce them in just a quick moment, but let me first go over some housekeeping items. Both the full video and the podcast recording will be available on our website and iTunes in the coming days. So with that, let me start by introducing our distinguished panelists. To my right, Yani Yanachkova, who is a director with Kohn Resnick Capital. And since she joined the firm in 2011, Yani worked on 2,700 megawatts of solar and wind tax equity and debt transactions. That's a lot for those of you who don't know what that means, as well as raised $1 billion in corporate capital. I will breeze through her resume. She can expand. She can expand on that later. But prior to Kohn Resnick, she was part of the global value portfolio management team at AllianceBernstein, and she also worked for Sun Edison and the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg before that. And as far as her education, she is an MBA and Masters of International Affairs from Columbia Business School, and from the Columbia CEPA. She received her undergraduate degree from Georgetown University. So that is Yani. Second to my right is Dawn Pasquin. She is the Chief Risk Officer for GE Capital's $15 billion energy financial services business. Dawn joined GE in 2002 and has held various risk positions, including debt and equity underwriting and portfolio management of power generation and renewable energy projects. Prior to GE, she worked for 12 years with ABB Financial Services. She holds an undergraduate degree from Rutgers University and an MBA in finance from our neighboring school, NYU. We're not going to hold that against her. And last but not least, Sarah Valdovinos, who is the co-founder of Walden Green Energy, a company focused on developing utility-scale renewable energy projects. Her company is backed by RWE, the large European utility. And Sarah's career prior to Walden includes being a managing director at Barclays, serving as the head of commodities origination for Latin America, Canada, and the US. She joined Barclays from Goldman Sachs, where she worked on the commodities Latin American desk. She also worked prior to that for Southern California Edison. So a lot of experience across the board, as you can see. Sarah got her undergraduate degree from UC San Diego and her MBA from the Anderson School at UCLA. So a very, very distinguished list of panelists. I will add 2 words about me. My resume is actually a lot shorter. I am the founder of Ardinal, which is an investment management firm I launched last year when I left with a team from Goldman Sachs, where I was for 15 years as a managing director and portfolio manager for our energy investments. My position at Goldman was my first and only job out of college before I started at Ardinal. So that's all I have. And as far as my undergraduate degree, I went to MIT for my bachelor's. I never went to graduate school, and my mom still gives me grief about that. But that's my bio. I wanted to give the panelists a few moments to expand on their career, and as they talk about their experience, I also wanted to see if they could speak a little bit about the the marquee transaction or the marquee deal that they worked that they felt was really transformational in their career, or to put it more simplistically, what was the funnest thing that you've ever worked on in your careers? So I'll start with Yanni.
Hello, everybody. As Maria mentioned, I'm a proud Columbia graduate and woohoo for Columbia Business School and SIPA. So thank you very much for having me. And again, it's a pleasure to be amongst all of these distinguished women. And I actually wanted to tell you the story of working on the smallest transaction I've ever worked on and realizing that I absolutely loved renewable energy investment banking. Right after, as I was graduating Columbia Business School, I was networking with, at the time, a small team at Conresent Capital. It was basically a startup group of the founder and another fellow Columbia MBA graduate, and they were starting an investment banking practice. Fast forward, almost 7 years from now. Right now, we're about 30 people. So let's just say that from employee number 3 to a 30-person firm, it's been quite a wild ride. But he needed help. He needed help back in 2011, and he needed me to put together a SIM, which is a confidential investment memorandum, for a 10-megawatt project. Now, that project was a series of small distributed generation assets over in California, in Napa and Sonoma. Apparently, there was a thing called biodynamic wine, and I learned a whole lot about biodynamic wine and how it was important for all of these wineries to also have a solar capability on their roofs so they can say, well, we're good for the environment, not just in our product, but in how we source our electricity. So to me, that was kind of the first transaction I worked on. And it is true, it was fun because I got to sample a lot of wines. But I also want to tell you that right now, the industry has become a major player across the globe. We have the largest utilities, the largest European players looking for opportunities to invest in the US. That was not the case 7 years ago. 7 years ago, transactions were a 10th or a 100th of the ticket size that they are today. We could go out with $10 million transaction on the market, and that was kind of run of the mill. Now we don't even, most of our investors wouldn't even look at a transaction unless it's $50 or $150 million. So the industry has been growing tremendously, but I also think that other smaller plays right now, like energy storage or offshore wind, which are rather small, I think can have a similar growth trajectory. So I'm just excited to be in the industry, which changes so quickly and has allowed me to have a fascinating career.
Dawn?
Yes, so as she mentioned, I'm the Chief Risk Officer of GE Energy Financial Services. It's a division of GE Capital, and I've been in the energy space probably longer than anybody here, 27 years at this point. Almost always as a principal investor in market-based transactions at GE, also at ABB before them. Our portfolio is about $13 billion now, about 65% equity, 35% debt. Not surprising, GE has tax capacity, and we also are one of the biggest manufacturers of wind turbines, and so about half of our portfolio is renewable. About 40% of our portfolio is wind tax equity. We've also invested in generation, pipelines, distribution, so all across the sector, and again, market-based transactions, and in different places in the capital structure, depending on the risk-reward trade-off. So debt, mezz, tax equity, common equity. The common equity we do is not what you'd find on a stock exchange. It's highly structured, project finance, energy equity. So I manage the portfolio, and we're due about $1 to $2 billion of new deals every year. To your point, small deals are awkward for us because it takes the same amount of overhead to do a small deal than a large deal. So, in the old days we were doing 400 or 500 million was our strike zone. Now it's more like 100 to 150 million. And I'm going to talk about a deal, one of the deals that was probably the most impactful for me on my career, and I think it seems odd if we're talking today about something I did 25 years ago or 20 years ago, but I think it's important, and it was very early on in my career, and we privatized a coal-fired power station in Morocco. And in addition to privatizing it, we invested and built 2 additional units, and it was 1,300 megawatt project. And we raised about 65% debt, and we had experienced equity sponsors developing the project. And the reason that I bring that up, I think, in this audience is because if you think about energy and policy, at the time, that plant, basically we built it and leased it back to the government through a long-term power purchase agreement. And by doing that, it freed up $1.5 billion of capital that they could invest in other things that maybe couldn't be so easily privatized, like education or medical or things like that. Secondly, you really had to have a close tie to the government. We had, as I said, we had a 30-year offtake agreement with the utility, who in and of itself was not creditworthy. We also had to negotiate an implementation agreement with the government to make sure that we could get our money out and that they would not interfere with our right to use the land, the space, et cetera. So that was critical. Not that many coal plants are going up, I think, in this world, maybe Indonesia and China, but back then, this plant was 65% of the capacity of Morocco, so it was critical for them making the leap from a emerging market to a more developed market. And then finally, we used the best available control technology. Coal is not clean, but we're doing the best we could. And then we also raised almost close to $950 million of debt from the likes of the World Bank, OPIC, the whole alphabet soup of multilaterals. And so everybody really came together to get the project done, and we're all very proud of it. And for me, I was out of business school 3 years, so just having the opportunity to work on that transaction, I was the modeler, the financial modeler. And when we thought for the students in the room, don't ever be afraid to just be the financial modeler. It's not always the sexiest job in the world, and you're up late and people are yelling at you, but if you want to understand how a project works, understanding the model is, in my opinion, critical. And then the other final part about it wasn't quite wine, but the power plant was along the coast in Morocco, and so the only place to stay when you were there was a Club Med facility. But we spent most of our time in Rabat and Casablanca, but still. So that's just some of the things that I take away. And it's not the on-trend technology, and it was certainly a long time ago, but I think the lessons learned exemplify how public policy does work closely with energy.
And thank you all for being here. It looks like you're as excited as we are about the opportunities in energy and finance. I'm curious, how many of you are current students, just by show of hands? All right.
How many are alumni?
Helpful. Thank you. I'm, as Maria mentioned, I'm a founder of Walden Green Energy. I'm a renewable energy developer, an investor, a recovering banker. I guess to be specific, I was in commodity derivatives originator. And the deal that I want to share with you is a more recent one that is probably the first taste of the world of being a down and dirty entrepreneur, down in the weeds, and really contrast to the large transactions that were referenced before. It was the first time I think I had ever driven at 14,000 feet. We're in the Andes in Peru, scouting rivers for run-of-river hydro projects. We're looking at a portfolio of projects, all greenfield, meaning there's nothing there except that literally you climb, you drive on these roads, and a local person will say, oh yeah, keep walking a few hours up that way and you'll see
this very interesting river where we can, potentially set up a run-of-river project. And really, the exciting part for me was it was really a clear contrast to what I was doing before, which was structuring transactions that had many, many more zeros than the ones that we were looking at that time. The projects, each one of those projects that we were looking at for hydro would be maybe 1 to 5 megawatts, so really small projects. Collectively, the portfolio was a pretty interesting opportunity for us because we were looking at and continue to look at deploying capital really during the riskiest part of the cycle, which is in the early stages where you have to do all the engineering studies, get all the permits, the rights to the land, et cetera, and you get those projects to the state where the folks like large infrastructure firms like Maria's actually funds and others can come in and invest billions of dollars. In any case, taking you back to the Andes up at 10, 12,000 feet. We were driving from one place to another, and it's really majestic when you're up there, except that, as much you can prepare with online research for altitude sickness, you never quite know when it's going to hit you. So we were driving from one place to one peak to another, essentially. So I think the highest we got was 15,000 feet, and I thought, I was fine. I was being really calm. Everything was okay. And my partners were really excited. We were crossing a point where it's the largest railed road crossing in the world. So it's not the largest, tallest peak, but it's the tallest. So everyone's really excited and, run out of the car, run to the crossing, take a picture, run back, and suddenly we realized that perhaps that was not the best choice. So everyone's sort of in the car trying to figure out who's the one who's the least nauseous so they can drive. So I end up driving. And we drive then for several hours, stopping periodically so people could sort of relieve themselves and do all sorts of things and try to combat this altitude sickness. And so, we're driving down to the next town and everyone's starving and just ready for food. And we get into this town, mining town with this, again, another record place, which is massive open pit mine. I don't know if you've ever seen these things. It's just like multiple football fields wide hole in the ground. And we get into a hut basically to eat. And so, you sort of close your eyes and eat and connect with the locals and ask what you ate later, because there were a lot of vegetarians that for that moment hunger took over and decided to just close their eyes and move forward. So we keep driving, and across the way you see towns that have been, kind of the boom and bust of the mining. Of the mining markets have a very, very significant impact on these towns. Sort of partially constructed buildings, a lot of partially constructed schools. And as you stop and talk to towns along the way, all of them are looking for opportunities to have more investment into their town. So it really, for me, was such a seminal moment in terms of my commitment to investing in renewables, because originally I thought, wow, I've gone from oil and gas and commodities, and now I'm going to invest in renewables and really kind of try to move the needle to counteract, some of the impacts that I indirectly potentially made before. But I realized that it went so much more, beyond that. You're making direct investments into the grid, and it's very necessary for resiliency and redundancy, and we'll talk about that later. But you're also creating jobs. You're investing as a result of these projects. You also have to make social investments. So you're investing in schools and clinics and really creating an important ecosystem that is kind of a critical and a sea change for a lot of communities. And I know that this seems so far away because it's in the Andes, but even when you bring it back home, and we'll talk about what the opportunities are, I think renewables, it's one of the fastest, it is the fastest growing job creator in America. It really offers a huge opportunity for the investor to make very attractive returns, but it also, I think, on a personal level, offers a lot of opportunity to create redundancy in the economy, which is another really critical point. So that's why that deal was so important to me.
All right.
Notwithstanding the altitude sickness, which I'll spare you.
Thanks for sharing. And before we get in earnest into the conversation, I wanted to maybe take a quick moment to lay out the lay of the land, if you will, in terms of energy mix, where we are today versus where we were 10 years from now, and primarily focusing on the U.S., but we'll touch on the international markets as well. And given my panelists focus primarily on renewables, I will take the evil role of representing oil and gas. Don't throw tomatoes, but I wanted to just give you the snapshot of where we are here in the U.S., because we can talk about renewables, but for the time being, the bulk of the energy, the power consumption in the U.S. Is conventional energy. So when you look at the oil markets right now, the U.S. is producing north of 10 million barrels a day, I think 10.5 to be precise, and that is a doubling from where we were 10 years ago. Only 10 years ago, we were at 5 million barrels, and we have since doubled the size of the U.S. Oil production to a great extent due to the shale revolution. When you think about the size of the U.S. Consumption market, we are consuming roughly just under 20 million barrels a day. So versus the 10 that we're producing, we're still an energy importer. But at the same time, given the growth in shale, we have started only recently to export oil. And that was a law, that was part of the policy that President Obama brought to bear. So all of a sudden, the U.S. goes from exporting oil, I think we're running right now at 2.3 million barrels a day, which is unprecedented, and becoming a really powerful force in the oil demand-supply equation. On the gas side, gas is measured in billion cubic feet a day. Our U.S. production is in the low 80 BCF a day. It used to be 50, again, just 7-10 years ago, before the gas shale production took off. Think about that tremendous growth. Think about the fact that with the reserves that we have found right now in Marcellus and Utica and some of the other shale plays that you guys probably are familiar with, the U.S. stands to become literally the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. We have gas coming out of our ears. The problem is that we actually need a way to export it, because gas, unlike oil, you can't put it in a tanker. You have to liquefy it. So in order to sustain the growth in natural gas production, we need to increase our ability to export it as LNG. But just to bring it back home, we have become a significant force in the gas market. And again, due to the shale revolution and to the advances that shale technologies have made possible in both the oil and the gas markets. So that's where we are right now. We are still very, very dependent on conventional energy sources. That is slowly changing from a lower base. I will let the panelists talk about the growth of renewables, about solar, wind. Yanni, do you wanna start with some of the stats that you wanted to share with us?
Yeah. So very often we think of renewables as kind of this nascent emerging technology. However, again, to go back to my initial remarks, it has really become a dominant force, and in fact is the #1 installed capacity in the U.S. In power is solar and wind. So just to give you a sense of where we are right now, by the end of 2017, we had about 50 gigawatts installed in solar and about 90 gigawatts of onshore wind. And these are all statistics that our friends over at Bloomberg BNEF shared with us. And by 2025, we expect that solar will triple, meaning that we're going to have a growth up to 150 gigawatts of installed capacity, and what they're forecasting is about like 9 gigawatts this year and then 12 to 14 gigawatts per year. So that's just enormous capacity, and solar is really, really picking up steam. We probably do need to check with them to figure out the impact of the tariffs. That impact is still kind of cycling through the market, and I would say that this might not reflect the full impact yet, but these were their projections at the time. For wind is also expecting to grow a lot. We're starting from a solid base, expected to grow to 140 gigawatts by 2025. And what essentially that means is that we expect wind to grow about 10 gigawatts a year until 2020. We also are seeing or are expecting to see some growth in offshore. They are forecasting 3 gigawatt of installed capacity by 2025. Again, I'm a very optimistic person, having ridden the huge wave of solar and wind installations, and I believe that offshore can follow a similar pattern. So it's just going to be full steam ahead. People are really focusing on deploying capital, especially now that we have a lot of regulatory certainty. We have certainty around the investment tax credit, the PTC, production tax credit, as well as certainty in tax reform and corporate tax rates.
So if you want to add to it, maybe from the standpoint of, the growth in solar, focusing on the distributed part of the market, and then on the wind side, talk to us about the really cool things that GE is doing in offshore wind and how big your latest generation of turbines is.
Yeah, we don't really do too much distributed solar gen right now. GE doesn't really have a big play there. We haven't been able to find the secret sauce of how people really make too much money there. We have been big investors, as I mentioned before, in the wind tax equity space, in wind generally, but also tax equity. And one thing I just want to kind of, if you look at where wind is going and where wind came from, just to add to Yanni's comments, there was tremendous growth in wind, for sure, over the past 20 years. And if you kind of look at it in the first, like from 2000 on, the first 10 years, then the next 10 years, back in 2000, there was less than 2 gigawatts of wind in the United States, and now there's, expected to be over 100 next year and 140 in 5 years. But if you look at, there was tremendous growth in the first 10 years, probably 35 to 40% on average during that period. And then in the second block of years, it's really slowed down quite a bit. Still a lot compared to other technologies, but maybe 10 to 15% per year. And it will probably, I think, levelize off at that right now. But that growth, I think, was very, very lumpy. And it was lumpy because of the nature of how the subsidies were given, right? The government gave the subsidies of the PTC because they wanted people to invest in the technology and drive the cost down. But you obviously want to wean people off of a subsidy. Industry isn't really healthy if it's relying on subsidies forever. And the way that the PTC worked was that you needed people who had tax base to use it. So during periods of financial crisis during that cycle, people had less tax base, so there was less investing. And then secondly, there was a kind of I would say a stop and start nature to the production tax credit, which would be, they'd renew it for a year, then it would lapse and it would be renewed retroactively, then and that would continue on for a couple of years. And so no manufacturers were really ready to make a big investment to drive the cost down without future certainty. And then after the financial crisis, I think 2010 or 11, they extended it for a longer period of time, and we really did start seeing the cost coming down to a point where now wind and solar is almost at parity with some of the other technologies generally, within an acceptable range. And so I think that's hopeful. But when you look at wind moving forward and solar to a certain extent, as they get more and more, and they're still, 7-8% of the total installed capacity in the U.S. growing. But with that comes some issues that the state and federal government is going to have to deal with, I think. On the wind side, it's an intermittent resource, and when the wind comes up or down, it creates a lot of grid instability. And so there's congestion, there's curtailment, economic curtailment, which investors are hesitant to invest too much in certain places where there's big transmission constraints like Texas. And so they need to solve the transmission issue. The production tax credit for wind is being phased out. And so with the curtailment issues and transmission issues, with the lower tax rate and the PTC phased out, there's really going to be more of a burden on, I think, this, in my opinion, on the states on how they're going to solve that, because somebody has to cover this subsidy. And it will probably likely be a combination of lower pricing from the equipment managers. They'll have to take cost out. It will probably be higher power prices somehow, or the states will have to, if the states really want to be serious about their renewable portfolio standards. I don't know if the states always say, many states, not all, but most states say they want to have a stated percentage of their energy from renewable sources by a particular date. So I think in California it's 50% by 2030. You know, some states are 20% by 2020, whatever the case may be. And so if they want to do that, and if no new coal plants are really going in the US, gas is still growing but slowing. So I think there was like 50 to 55 gigawatts a year of gas, and now it's about 40. So that's slowing down too. Some of the nukes, 3 nukes were announced coming off recently. So renewable will have to fill the gap, but somebody's going to have to bear the price of that. And so I think that, and dealing with the grid stability is a big growth area that we're looking into. Using batteries, for example. Batteries can, you know, if you're in a windy place and then the wind drops down, it creates tremendous instability on the grid. It can cause problems. So having a battery that can ramp up quickly to cover that load is a good solution. There's other storage solutions. They're still expensive and somewhat nascent. The battery's coming down a lot, but there's still work to be done there. So I think that's kind of where we see things going in the U.S.
And I'm going to be the eternally optimistic developer. We call it developeritis. Everything's going to be okay, and we're going to make a lot of money out of it, is usually the way we approach things. Just a couple of thoughts. I think costs, first of all, costs. Second of all, we'll talk about consumer demand, generally speaking. And third is, I think, just the other technologies. I mean, costs have come down significantly, and they will continue to come down. Obviously, as markets mature, the speed at which the adoption of these technologies, whether solar, wind, et cetera, will start to become more stable. Excuse me. But just from looking at 2008 to 2015, batteries dropped. I think the prices dropped 40%. More than that, right? Depending on you. Utility scale ones dropped at least 50 to 60%. And then electric vehicle batteries dropped significantly as well. Why does that matter? As we look forward, some of the issues that were brought up, whether it's the tariffs on solar panels, whether it's the intermittency issues that will that are going to be resolved by batteries, the cost of the technologies are moving down so quickly that they will more than offset a lot of the headwinds that some of these issues that were brought up. So I'm generally optimistic. Electric vehicles is another space to keep an eye on, because they benefit from the overall investment in R&D that's happening in the battery space. Electric vehicles, I know it's not very exciting, 2 million vehicle inventory, but it is when you look at how quickly we've gotten there. And really the constraints have been around the infrastructure and electric vehicle charging infrastructure and around batteries. And we know, Tesla's made a huge investment to debottleneck the battery side of it. And I think that the infrastructure will proceed as moving forward as well. And I think about it more like ATMs. I mean, some of you might not remember, but back in the day, like, you had to go find the ATM for your bank. You couldn't go get cash from anywhere else. And, God forbid you were somewhere in the middle of, nowhere where there wasn't, strong telephone connection, then you would just carry around traveler's checks. Now you can really, literally, almost in the middle of Sahara, go and take cash out. And so, to me, I think when I think about electric vehicle infrastructure, I think that it'll go in that way. It's going to be a software solution and a tech solution that will make make the access ubiquitous. And I think as the technology cost curves continue to go down, they will more than offset some of the headwinds that we're hearing. I think some of the issues that you both brought up.
Not to be the negative one on the panel, Sarah, but 2 million electric vehicles in the car park of 1.2 billion going to 2 billion. That's probably going to take a long time to dent the demand for petroleum products.
Absolutely. I think that that's why, again, looking at this, the opportunity here, I think this is why there is, for those of you, there's a variety of reasons, I'm sure you guys are all here, but I think that's where the opportunity is. There is such a big runway to go. I recognize some folks are arguing for 100% renewables, and that's a very laudable argument. I really am just looking at the next increment. We've gone from, we've doubled in many cases. And so there's a lot of opportunity for investment along the value chain. And currently there is a space and a need for all of these technologies to coexist. One of the last points that I wanted to mention around distributed energy resources is that what's driving the need for distributed energy resources is really not so much investors looking for a return, it's resiliency. All of the hurricanes and the cities are really now prioritizing this and moving the conversation forward. How long is it going to take for them to resolve it is anyone's guess, and we can argue about that for hours. Getting the utilities to set out tariffs that will seamlessly integrate the distributed resources into the grid is another story, but the need is now really pushing so many cities, a need for resiliency kind of that goes beyond just the pure economic drivers. I think will help solve some of the issues.
I think that's right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, the FERC 841 is basically told the utilities you have a year to figure it out, right? So hopefully it will get the conversation going at least.
I do want to go back to the point that Dawn made on storage, and a lot of people think that storage really is the holy grail in terms of accelerating penetration of solar and wind. So maybe you can talk about where you see storage technologies. A lot of them are still fairly immature, and what that could mean to the penetration of solar and wind.
So we have a whole group. We have at GE, we have what's called the Global Research Center, and they're looking at a lot of different types of technology. Most of them are still nascent and not really that unveiled for prime time, but definitely we're looking at battery storage as a viable option. And we mentioned the cost of the battery coming down immensely over the years and the quality of the battery. So I think and the battery can stand alone, or you can put it on a wind farm or a solar farm. If you look at, for example, this phenomenon, they call it the duck curve. I don't know if any of you heard that in California, where, the curve during the day, with historical mix of energy, would be a peak during the day from typical resources when people are at work or factories or have air conditioning or whatever going. And now, because of all the behind-the-meter solar, everybody's solar's, there's almost no demand for electricity from thermal sources during the day, but then it spikes when people go home. And so people just have to adjust to that. And it's pretty exciting in the industry. We were talking before, we've all been in the energy space for a while, and the concepts are really all the same. It's just the technologies change, and the same people are really kind of hanging around the industry for all the time. And so it's just finding new applications for what we used to do for something else, I think, as we go forward, and we'll figure it out. The one thing that you mentioned that I didn't talk about, which I probably should have before, is the offshore wind. There's the first offshore wind in the United States was done last year, used GE Alstom technology. Offshore wind in the U.S., I think, has some potential. It was much more common in Europe, which I think if you think about it, Europe is very land constrained, so they were forced to go offshore. And we have so much windy areas, the whole plains in the U.S., and enough land-based wind that we weren't forced to go offshore. Block Island is a good test project. It's still expensive. It's expensive for Rhode Island generally, but it's less expensive than what Block Island had with very expensive and dirty diesel before. So that's a benefit. The thing about Block Island is there's only 5 turbines, and so if you go, if one goes down, you lose 20% of your capacity, and so you need to think about that. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen them, or if you're a boater, go take a look out there. They are huge. They are immense. And if something breaks, in a typical wind farm, what are the hubs, 100 meters, 120 meters now, the high ones.
134.
Yeah, they're getting higher, but you can have a crane and do that. And if some of these offshore wind maintenance, you need a ship to come from Europe to fix it. And so there's costs associated with that I think people will work out, and I think it's definitely something we want to look towards in the future.
The topic of the panel today is around the shifting energy environment and the drivers behind some of these changes, and policy is obviously a significant one. But let's talk about consumer preferences and to what extent some of these changes can be accelerated, not necessarily by legislation, but by consumers making the conscious decision to go green or to not want to go the old dirty way of getting their power sources. So how much of the consumer preferences are you seeing shifting the energy landscape?
I just read recently, Nielsen did a study, I think in 2014, and they found, this is specifically surveying millennials and Gen Z, and I think like 3 out of 4 said that they were willing to pay more for a product from a company that had clear corporate responsibility and sustainability goals and had something, either explicit or stated. And so that's just one example from a consumer perspective of what's driving the demand across the board, and it translates to public listed companies that are now, and you can talk about this, you guys are listed, that are now kind of really making significant changes internally to represent and actually embody more sustainable initiatives.
They all got the letter from Larry Fink.
They all got the letter from Larry Fink is another great example. And I think, and back to the electric vehicle example, those consumers and those are the buyers that I'm thinking, will be the ones that will be supporting electric vehicles, electric vehicle demand, and all of the infrastructure and the ecosystem that goes with it, as an example. And I think utilities are probably having the same reaction right?
Yeah, like at GE, we have this concept of kind of a buzzwords that we use, for energy. Where are we going with energy? Decentralization, decarbonization, and digitization. Mm-hmm. And I think decentralization is relevant in the U.S. You talked about a lot of the issues that we need to get there, and I think we will. But if you think about the rest of the world, and especially the emerging markets who have tremendous need for energy, and if you just think about cell phones back in the day, in some of the emerging markets in the developing world, they never built out the landlines. By the time the technology got there, they just leapfrogged right over it and into the cellular. And so you can envision a world where, as the costs come down and the technology gets better, with solar, and it can compete with coal and other things, you can bring that out, and there's no reason why they can't leapfrog over large centralized power plants. And with that also becomes data. Data is very critical to that, how people use energy. You could use data, to mine the data with the technology that we have to, do preventive maintenance or just other things, unlocks a whole lot of value, which again can bring the cost down.
Yeah, a concrete example that I would like to share is, for instance, Re100. So Re100 is alliance where corporates are essentially opting in to have the goal of sourcing 100% of their energy from renewable sources. And the way that it's translating into our industry and into projects that we're seeing right on our desk is through corporate procurement via corporate PPAs. So one of the most important attributes of renewables, and given the nature of the capital that is primarily investing, is to de-risk the asset, de-risk credit by having a contracted, long-term contracted asset. So being able to, again, as Sarah and Dawn were saying, being able to influence corporates to be responsive to their own customers and to understand that by coming out with a mandate that's rather ambitious, that is putting a new pressure that is not dictated neither from DC nor from Paris, but it's really kind of driven from on-the-ground interest and commitment to sustainability, which is then translating into a lot more assets being built.
But the one thing that I wanted to add, which surprised me recently, was going again to the dirty oil and gas market. People were looking at the growth, the demand drivers for oil and gas, and we all know that eventually we'll get to a peak in gasoline demand. We all know that eventually we'll find ways to squeeze more power savings and reduce electricity consumption. But people looked at petrochemicals as being the next, the area of growth that will take the current oil demand to 10 million barrels higher, maybe 10 years from now. And now that tide is changing because people look at petrochemicals and they look at plastics the same way that they were looking at coal. And frankly, especially the new generation, millennials think that having this is a horrible thing. They bring their own glass bottles or metal bottles. So the idea was that petrochemicals was somehow going to get us to grow in the traditional conventional oil and gas market. And those assumptions are being severely challenged as of right now because plastic is just as dirty of a word as coal is. Or it's slowly becoming more and more so. But I wanted to go back to technology because technology is what's changing all of these dynamics so quickly. In what inning are we in terms of further savings in the cost of a solar panel, or how much more down the technology curve can we bring down the wind competitiveness? So I'll start with you, Dawn, on wind. And then maybe I'll challenge Sarah and Yanni on the solar side.
I think you can get cost out of wind. I still think that you can, and I think I mentioned before, as we wean yourself off the subsidy, you need to drive cost further down. I don't know what inning we're in. I don't know too much about baseball. Maybe sixth or seventh.
Right before the stretch.
But I think that there is room. There is room.
Further cost down.
Yeah. The other thing I think we talk about policy, but not to underestimate the impact of macroeconomic factors too on the changing technology. And if you just think for years and years and years, the EPA was noodling around with what to do with coal and scrubbers and in the end, the proliferation of the gas pretty much is killing coal and nuclear itself. You didn't need public policy couldn't do. The proliferation of natural gas was taking care of it.
Horizontal drilling.
Yeah.
What about further cost downs on the solar panel side, Yanni?
I mean, just from my experience over the past 7 years, we have seen dramatic decrease in solar costs and build costs. So we're not only talking about solar panels coming down dramatically, but the balance of the plant costs as well coming down. And what we're really seeing right now is that solar panel cost is actually a minor component of the overall cost of the entire system. Like if we have $1 a watt system, call it at utility scale, not at Resi, but at utility scale, the PV panel is probably less than 40 cents after being installed, really. So a lot of it has to do with how well are we able to streamline the process, how are we able to offer that opportunity to install larger and larger plants. So scale is really what drives that decrease in costs. And with solar, we see that very much like a beneficial cycle, which is self-reinforcing cycle, where the more solar you install, obviously, the better and more cost-effective it becomes. And we don't anticipate that decreasing in speed or in direction even after the implementation of the tariffs.
And I think, we have China to thank for that, right? I think they were over 50% of the installed capacity. And they are, again, driven partially by air pollution, right? They've got this need and very aggressive capacity goals in terms of the renewable energy component, specifically in solar. So that's going to continue to speed things along as well on the solar side. What's interesting and exciting about solar is now we're getting to the point where a lot of the research and development is in different sort of composites to be able to do like solar tiles. And I just saw a really cool TED Talk, and these things were gorgeous. They were like little stars. You can print them, and they're super thin, wafer thin. Clearly not commercial, yet from like my perspective, my investor hat, but just you could see where things are moving in that direction and really compressing. I mean, I think at last count, wind and solar grid parity, which means they compete in at least 30 countries. Mm-hmm. So the costs, and that's all really largely due to costs of the components. I think there's still a lot to squeeze out of those parts. Certainly, though, in terms of where you have a lot more to go would be, I would say, batteries. That's definitely where I think the biggest opportunity is for cost reduction. Personally.
And I want to touch also on the technology side and the advances that we're seeing right now in technology being transported to the energy world. So talking about AI, talking about big data, talking about your Predix platform, mm-hmm. which will be the probably prominent system for mm-hmm. analyzing big data and becoming the Internet of Things main platform. Who are the winners? Who are the losers in this big data moving slowly into the energy patch?
I don't know who the winners and losers are going to be. I think I think that it can unlock a lot of value generally. And if you just take a wind farm, for example, if there's a problem, the wind farm goes down, so you have to go do maintenance. You have to bring a crane out. You have to have people go up and fix it, and it's time off the grid, and it's a loss of capacity. And with technology, for example, you can do what they call a digital twin, and so you can sit in the control room and you can actually see how the wind is blowing, and all this data that you can capture from the historical wind performance. And if you can find out what patterns there are to suggest that there might be another outage, you can then try to fix that through this digital twin before the event really happens. And
so the maintenance companies are the losers. They're going to have less and less business if there's fewer outages.
Well, I suppose, but the maintenance companies also are the equipment manufacturers, and so you just have to figure out who the what the business model, I think the business model will adapt, right? But,
More integration.
yeah, more integration, but if you think about it, the whole goal should be, I mean, we take for granted that you walk home and you put your lights on and everybody has electricity. We don't even think about it, but in a lot of places in the world, it's not like that. And the goal should always be to get the cost as low as possible, which is not necessarily as investors what we like. As long as you factor it into your decision-making, it shouldn't be a problem, though.
Did you want to add something, Sarah? No. We're actually running out of time as far as the panel. I would love to open this to questions, and I see a first question in the audience, please.
Yes. You mentioned at the beginning that the biggest development in the energy world is actually the shale gas revolution and the production of LNG that's related to it. I wanted to talk about the shale gas revolution and the LNG. I thought this was the energy panel and not the renewable energy panel. And so essentially, from what I understand, and I lived in Texas for a long time, is that the U.S. LNG infrastructure is pretty much built up, and there is a lot of investment going in right now. But as you mentioned, Maria, is that the U.S. is very interested in exporting a lot of LNG to other countries. So my question to you is, are you involved in building up the LNG infrastructure in other countries, in emerging markets, or maybe in Western Europe, or other places abroad where the U.S. can export?
I am not personally involved in any of those, but I can talk about it. There's a couple of things. The U.S. has started exporting LNG. Last year was the first train that they brought online. With the growth of oil comes associated gas. So studies have looked at the expected growth of oil demand, of oil production in the U.S. and have estimated that we're going to need to build probably another 20 BCF of liquefaction capacity just to take care of the gas that's coming, that's associated with the oil. That is a significant amount of infrastructure, $100 billion plus of dollars that need to go in the ground to sustain that growth in oil production by creating an outlet for natural gas. At the other side of the coin, you have the liquefaction installations that countries that need LNG. China, India, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, for example, and the cost of regasifying are not insignificant. So you're going to see a lot of build out on both sides of the equation. And as far as additional LNG capacity coming into the market, you're seeing a lot out of East Africa. You're seeing still a tremendous amount of LNG coming out of the Middle East. The question, though, is you as an investor, given how competitive the U.S. Gulf Coast has become, and given how technology advances have significantly decreased the cost of building LNG in the U.S., as an investor, I would much rather prefer everything else being equal, the ability to build in the U.S. and contract under U.S. law, as opposed to going to Mozambique. Was that your question?
I was asking whether any one of you were involved in it, in financing it.
So we, at GE, I talked a little bit earlier on very briefly about risk-reward trade-off, and we have made some debt investments in some of the LNG, well, they were import facilities, and then they were repurposed a couple of years later as export facilities. And we did small investments in debt because we like that place in the capital structure, given some of the technology risk around it. And in those deals, we wanted 100% take or pay from credit-worthy off-takers like Total or somebody else. Otherwise, it was just a risk that as a financial investor, we couldn't get comfortable with. One thing we're seeing a little bit of in Africa is off the coast of West Africa, where they do have some gas, is they're trying to use the floating vessels as the liquefaction factory, if you will. And we're looking at a couple of those. I don't know if we're going to get there yet, and they're sort of nascent. I would say it's a new application of a proven technology. We generally only do proven technology, so we'll see if we get there or not. But it is an interesting thing that I'm seeing develop in that market.
Those are primarily smaller scale, right?
Much smaller scale, like, I don't know, 100 megawatts or even less.
Yeah, and I think just to put things in perspective I think it's roughly $1.7 trillion invested in energy across the spectrum, oil, gas, et cetera. I think 90% of that was done on balance sheet. I mean, it's a small
Yes.
fraction, right? It's about, right? And I think under 10%, I don't know if it was 6 or 7%, that was done as project finance, right? And most of that was renewables, which means, kind of long-term contracted assets. And I think that speaks to, what you both were discussing in terms of the issues of where sort of the geopolitical risks associated with some of these large investments across the globe primarily, and also because prices are low, no one wants to do, contract for super long periods of time for the offtake, which means that project finance, again, is kind of moot. Everyone's hoping prices are going to go higher.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
So the Paris Accord goal is to keep us well below 2 degrees centigrade. We're not going to make that. What I'm hearing is we need to ramp up about 5 times in renewables, what's currently been, for the last year or two, of tremendous growth. Certainly agree with you. Do any of you foresee our ability to amp up an additional 5 times the tremendous growth we've been seeing for the last year or two in order to meet the Paris goals?
Let me start by saying that there have been significant amounts of infrastructure funds and capital raised, and a lot of those funds will go towards renewable energy projects. I'll also say that at the other end of the spectrum, you have the very large sovereign wealth funds and state pension plans deliberately selling out of their conventional energy investments and moving into renewables. So, for example, Norway Sovereign Fund, which is the largest fund, it's $1 trillion in assets, has made the decision a year or so ago to divest completely all the oil and gas investments and to focus exclusively on renewable projects. The large U.S. pension plans in the U.S., the CalPERS, the CalSTRS of the world, have made the same decision, and you're looking here at hundreds and hundreds of billions that are shifting away from conventional into renewable. So there is a lot of capital looking to be deployed in those renewable projects. That's also why returns have slowly been compressed over time. I mean, Yanni can talk about how, you could probably get double-digit returns on some of the existing cash-flowing projects, and now you're lucky to get mid to, 5 to 7%. So there's a lot of capital that's looking to get deployed in that space, and that's obviously a good tailwind for renewables.
Well, let's go back to how renewables are financed in the U.S. Obviously, they're reliant on subsidies, and in order to realize the value of those subsidies, we need to line up tax equity. And hopefully Dawn will advocate for cheaper tax equity, right?
Yes, please.
Supply and demand.
Right. But project finance for individual assets is really a struggle. For a lot of the developers, it takes too long. It has a certain level of uncertainty in terms of the covenants that they're going to end up having to represent, the reps and warranties. So kind of the less sexy stuff that we like talking about, how we finance renewable energy. And one of kind of the unwritten benefits that my firm has really tried to develop is show how we can finance portfolios at a time. So bundle assets and make the whole process a lot more efficient. That said, I think that as we have this this step down of tax benefits, what we're going to see is there's going to be less of a prevalence of the structured equity transactions, which are, again, very beneficial for equity owners, but because they're bringing the overall cost of capital down, but at the same time creating that necessity of structuring each individual asset, especially at the wind side. Usually assets are financed one by one, and hopefully have easier time scaling transactions, being able to finance portfolios, and that could make the overall process better. Is that going to result in a 5x installation of growth? Absolutely not. It's just going to make it cheaper to overall project costs. So we need more than that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Look, there's capital that wants to be deployed. There's a lot of capital that wants to be deployed, but Sarah mentioned with prices so low in the U.S., there's just not a lot of return for investors. There are Canadian pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds who have a lower cost of capital, so they are getting involved in that now. We see that, but it's going to take time.
I think from the policy side, I would, again, for me, renewables is really a local game, so I would really keep an eye on the policies at the state level. Those are going to have a much more, I think, significant impact on moving the needle. California, for example, beginning of January, they have CPUC had a rulemaking that allowed behind-the-meter battery storage to be able to participate in more than one market. It seems like kind of common sense that, oh, well, they should be able to kind of participate across the spectrum, but they couldn't before. You could only participate either serving the consumer, but not, you couldn't go out and support distribution or transmission. Now they can go and really participate and serve whatever need is in the market. And that's going to encourage people like me, developers, to go take risks on projects, battery projects, which, again, just reminding you, I'm the one that's in that early part, right? So speculating, thinking that I'm going to take a risk on this project because in a year or two, or in the case of wind, sometimes it takes 5 years, there'll be someone who will want that, some investor who will want to invest in it, right? So as these policies change, it encourages a lot more folks to go out and invest in earlier stages, which will actually move the needle, I think, in the long run.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the U.S. as one market, and if you look at Europe, I think it depends a lot on, the way that they subsidize the renewables. Wind, for example, in Europe, is they use this concept of a feed-in tariff, where we do it through our tax base. They charge a higher, the utilities or the state-owned entities will sign long-term offtake agreements and then pass that cost on to the consumer. And so as the prices start coming down, that's great, but in the meanwhile, if it's more expensive, the political ability to keep continuing to invest in renewables and pass that cost on to the consumer becomes a very political discussion.
There was one more question in the back. Yes? 2 questions. You can go ahead.
Hi, Nico Warden, Copperwood Energy, and I was wondering if you could compare like a market-based model and how that affects renewable development or financing versus a more vertically integrated model. I think about like different states like Texas versus Colorado or Florida. Thanks.
Any takers?
No,
You want me to-
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah.
As a developer.
Yeah, as a developer. You should guess, right? I prefer the market-based model. I think that it aligns the incentives appropriately, and it allows for development to happen where it needs to, right? So, did you want to say? Okay, so what that means, right, is case in point, right now, everyone's talking about cryptocurrencies and blockchain. When I was recently at a blockchain and energy conference, and I feel like we need to say blockchain at least once before this panel's over. And
You said it.
yes, so it's done. I'll check that off the list. What was interesting, once you get past all the hoopla, is that the market-based model will allow folks, all the entrepreneurs who are in that space, to create solutions that help the utilities that are slower moving. And maybe you can talk about sort of some of the limitations for, let's say, even GE, which is innovative, but publicly listed, right? And we talked about this earlier when your venture got spun out, but some of the utilities that, as much as we harp on them and they're terrible and, move so slow, by their nature, they have limitations. And so when you create a market-based model, it allows for the investment and the innovation to happen where it needs to happen, which is in the case of blockchain, they're coming up with solutions that help all of the utilities potentially integrate, let's say, fleet of electric vehicles, right? And you can only do that when and you can only do that when you have access to data, transparency, and prices, which the market-based model begets.
I think it depends very much on the market, right? So if you look at California, they have solar, right? So that is one model. If you look at Texas, where it's really a market-based model, and there was such a rush into Texas that now power prices are so low, and there's so much curtailment that until they fix that problem, I think in the long run it'll work out, but in the short run right now, people are kind of pulling away from Texas, and that's kind of the market signal that says we need to fix the things before we go back in. So I also think it's a better model, but it's, I think, place by place. If you look at PJM, it's more gas-driven than renewable, but you're seeing the same thing. I think the market signals are saying prices aren't enough to attract investment in PJM right now. Lenders want to invest higher cover ratios, equities not getting the return they want, so there's gaps in financing. So, I personally think that you should listen to the market signals, and they should dictate how we invest.
But you need transparency, right?
Yeah,
and
yes.
access to data so that, and policy to align accordingly, which it's hard to get the unicorn.
Right. Like in PJM and Texas, you have pretty good information. California, not so much because it's still a bilateral market, so it's harder there, I think.
Any last questions from the audience? 1, 2. I take that as a no. I actually want to ask one more question, and I'll start with Dawn. A lot of the changes have come from the technology world, from Silicon Valley. GE has made a conscious effort to be present in the Valley, to focus on attracting talent and competing, head-to-head with the Googles and the Amazons of the world. How significant is the need for deep technological talent in the energy patch, and are we able to compete, frankly, with the internet companies?
So I think that we can. For us as a manufacturer, it's not only about the coding and what Silicon Valley does. It's also about how you make the process, how do you get the better equipment, digital printing, stuff like that, which helps reduce the supply chain cost, which is, that's where we're making a lot of advancements. I guess what I'm saying is I think people can coexist. There's plenty to do.
Talent in your spaces, Yanni, Sarah, is it easy to get? Is it hard to get?
I think that the talent in the United States is by definition hard to get because it's such a competitive marketplace, and it's supposed to be. And so we're always, as a firm, looking for bright minds and kind of motivated and interested people. So do please reach out to us if you're looking. That said, I want to give you a counter anecdote, which is from one of our wind developers, a private developer whose connections in the Iowa community have resulted in a number of wind farms where they're basically using farmland, right, to site a whole bunch of land and build up wind farms. And so, to everything that technology can deliver to us, there's also a lot to be said on boots on the ground and having and building capabilities, especially in the development realm, with people who have kind of old-fashioned, more kind of traditional skill set of being able to site land, permit it, understand what it takes to really develop a project is just as important as being to optimize operations once you put up the turbines.
Local connectivity, that's what you maybe needed in the Andes.
We had it, yes, exactly, yes. But I completely agree. I think renewables is absolutely, and I think energy in general, it's a pretty statement, is a local game. It is about local boots on the ground, as you described it. That's absolutely right.
Well, with this, I wanted to thank you everybody for joining us. I have a couple of things to read before departing. I wanted to mention again that the full video of the recording will be available on our website in a few days, and you can also subscribe to our podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms that I know nothing about. And this is one of the number of events that we're hosting in the coming weeks. The upcoming event that I wanted to highlight is one called Where Next on Climate? Conservative Prescriptions on Climate Change, and that happens on April 30th at 5 o'clock. And the list of speakers is very impressive, and it includes Dr. Glenn Hubbard, your Dean for Columbia Business School, and many other prominent speakers. So thank you for your time. I hope to see you again soon, and please join me in thanking our speakers this evening.